I never imagined waking up to find my stepson Dylan in my wife's place, the horrifying realization of the previous night's events hitting me with the force of a physical blow. Every touch, every gesture, it had felt like Julia, but it wasn't. The shock left me reeling, questioning everything I thought I knew, and dreading the potential consequences. My name is David, and for the past 5 years, I've been happily married to Julia. She embodied everything I desired in a partner: caring, humorous, intelligent, and effortlessly beautiful. Her presence made me feel incredibly fortunate every single day. Julia had a son from a previous relationship, Dylan, who was 22 when we met. He was a quiet, introverted young man, often keeping to himself. I respected his privacy, understanding the complexities of blended families. Initially, Dylan and I maintained a distant relationship. I was simply the man his mother had married, a role I accepted without issue. Julia and I had our own established dynamic, and Dylan seemed content in his own world. We resided in a comfortable house on the edge of town, surrounded by a vast expanse of woods that stretched endlessly behind our property. Julia and Dylan were my family, and I strived to be a good husband and stepfather. However, there was always something unsettling about Dylan's quiet observation of me. He possessed a silent intensity that occasionally made me uneasy. It wasn't a sense of danger, but rather a feeling of being scrutinized, leaving me to wonder about his thoughts. Whenever I caught him looking, he would quickly avert his gaze, as if caught doing something forbidden. I dismissed it as typical teenage behavior, assuming he was simply navigating the complexities of adolescence. Then, a subtle shift occurred. One night, Julia departed on a business trip, a scheduled event that had been planned for weeks. While I wasn't thrilled about her absence, I anticipated a peaceful weekend at home with Dylan. I envisioned quiet days filled with video games, movies, and takeout meals. But the night she left, an unspoken tension filled the air between Dylan and me. I brushed it off, thinking, it's just Dylan and me. What could possibly go wrong? The evening began innocently enough. We shared dinner, discussed school, and watched a movie. Dylan was his usual polite but reserved self. He retired to his room early, mentioning homework, though he didn't appear particularly engaged in academic pursuits. I finished the dishes, tidied the house, and decided to call it a night. Around midnight, I climbed into bed, the cool sheets a welcome relief. Thoughts of Julia drifted through my mind as I drifted off to sleep. But I was completely unprepared for what happened next. Around 3:00 a.m., a disquieting feeling jolted me awake. It wasn't a noise, but more of a sense of being watched. My room was dark, illuminated only by a sliver of moonlight filtering through the blinds. My mind was foggy with sleep, but my senses were heightened. I could hear faint footsteps on the floor, slow and deliberate, as if someone was cautiously moving through the room. I froze, peering into the darkness, unsure if I was dreaming or if someone was actually present. My heart began to race. It must be Julia, I thought, but why would she be acting like this? The footsteps ceased. Then, to my astonishment, I felt the bed shift as if someone had sat down beside me. A heavy presence settled over the room, yet an unnerving stillness remained. I opened my eyes, struggling to make sense of the situation. Then, I felt a warm hand on my arm. My breath hitched, and I instinctively tensed. "Julia?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. There was no response. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, my heart pounding in my chest. The hand continued its slow, deliberate descent down my arm, as if gauging my reaction. I could feel its warmth, a tenderness that felt strangely out of place. Then, the softest of lips brushed against my cheek, a feather-light kiss that stole my breath and sent my mind reeling. "David," a voice whispered, hushed and gentle. It was a voice I recognized instantly, yet it wasn't Julia's. It was Dylan's. I shot upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. My mind raced, struggling to comprehend the situation. In the dim light, Dylan sat beside me, his dark eyes wide, his expression unreadable, yet unsettling. A strange mixture of confusion and an inexplicable attraction washed over me. "Dylan, what the hell are you doing?" I gasped, trying to suppress the growing unease that was taking root in my thoughts. Instead of answering, Dylan leaned closer, his face inches from mine, his breath warm against my skin. Then, without warning, his lips pressed against mine. The kiss was soft, hesitant at first, as if testing a boundary, a limit. My body stiffened, my mind screaming at me to push him away, to halt this madness before it escalated. But my body betrayed me, responding to his touch in a way I couldn't explain or control. The kiss deepened, and a wave of heat flooded my senses. This isn't real, I thought. This can't be happening. Finally, I managed to break away, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my chest. "Dylan!" I snapped, panic lacing my voice. "What the hell is this? Why are you—" Before I could finish my sentence, Dylan rose from the bed, his expression inscrutable. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me trembling and bewildered. I stared at the empty doorway, my mind racing, trying to process what had just occurred. Time seemed to freeze as I replayed the events over and over again. The kiss. Dylan. Why? What did it mean? I had always sensed a strange intensity in him, a quietness that held unspoken depths, but this was beyond anything I could have imagined. I attempted to rationalize it as a mistake, a bizarre, twisted error. Perhaps he was sleepwalking. Or maybe it was a misunderstanding, a strange impulse he hadn't intended to act upon. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Dylan wasn't prone to such mistakes, and I wasn't one to ignore them. This was just the beginning. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was all a bad dream, a bizarre nightmare that had somehow bled into reality. He's just a kid, I reasoned, a confused teenager acting out in some way. I clung to the hope that it was nothing more than that when I woke up, I would be able to look at him with the same detachment I always had. But when I opened my eyes that morning, the events of the previous night still clouded my thoughts. I couldn't shake the image of Dylan's face so close to mine, the feeling of his lips soft and warm against my own. The memory of my body's involuntary response sickened me. I went through the motions of the day, making breakfast, getting ready for work, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I kept glancing at Dylan's door, half expecting him to emerge and act as if nothing had happened. But he didn't. He didn't come down for breakfast. The house felt strangely empty without his presence. I told myself he was probably hiding in his room, embarrassed or ashamed. I tried to dismiss it, but every time I closed my eyes, the memory of the kiss resurfaced. A constant, unwelcome reminder of the night before. The unsettling feeling that this was just the beginning of something much more complicated continued to grow. My mind relentlessly replayed the soft pressure of his lips, the warmth of his body pressed close to mine. The sensation lingered, a phantom touch I couldn't shake. I tried to concentrate on work, but my thoughts kept returning to Dylan, to the kiss that had shaken me to my core. It wasn't just the act itself, but the context. His deliberate entry into my room, the intimacy and purposefulness of his actions. This was no mistake. It was deliberate, a realization that settled in my stomach with a growing unease. Later that evening, Julia called, her business trip concluded, and her return imminent. She inquired about Dylan and me, and I told her things had been quiet. Too quiet, in fact. I couldn't bring myself to mention the night before, unable to articulate the inexplicable events, to tell her that her son had kissed me, had invaded my space in a way I couldn't comprehend. But the moment I ended the call, I knew something had to change. I couldn't maintain the facade of normalcy any longer. I had to confront Dylan to understand what was happening. As the house fell silent and darkness descended, I heard his footsteps again. This time, I was prepared. I didn't try to ignore them or dismiss them as my imagination. I had to face this. Had to know. The clock read 2:30 a.m. when the faint sound of his footsteps reached my ears, slow and deliberate, mirroring the previous night. My pulse quickened, But this time, I didn't try to suppress the fear that gripped me. I lay still in bed, eyes wide open in the darkness, a mixture of dread and morbid curiosity keeping me frozen. The door creaked open, and Dylan entered the room, just as before. I couldn't see his face in the darkness, but I felt the weight of his presence. He moved to the side of the bed and stood there silently, watching me. "Dylan," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. "What is this? Why are you coming in here?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached out and brushed a lock of hair off my forehead, a gesture so tender it made my breath hitch. His fingers lingered on my skin, as if savoring the contact. "David." His voice was barely a whisper, low and almost soothing. "I need you to understand." "Understand what?" I asked, my voice near a tremor. "What is it you want from me?" He remained silent for a moment, then climbed onto the bed, sitting beside me. His body was so close I could feel the heat radiating from him. I wanted to pull away, to shove him off, but a strange primal instinct kept me frozen in place. "Dylan, this isn't you," I said, my voice trembling now. This isn't right." His lips curved into a faint smile, and he finally spoke. "It's not about right or wrong. It's about what I want." I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. "What do you want?" Dylan didn't respond immediately. He leaned in closer, his breath warm against my ear. "I want to show you, David. I want to show you how it feels." His words sent shivers down my spine, yet I couldn't stop myself from reacting. The heat of his body was intoxicating, his closeness making my heart race despite every fiber of my being screaming at me to push him away. But I couldn't. And then, without warning, he kissed me again. This time, it wasn't tentative or soft. It was urgent, demanding. His lips pressed firmly against mine, his body moving closer until his chest was flush against mine. For a moment, I was paralyzed, overwhelmed by a confusing mix of desire, fear, and utter bewilderment. I didn't know what to do, how to stop it. I froze, my body tense and rigid, as if trapped in a nightmare. The kiss was urgent, desperate, leaving no room for resistance. Dylan's lips were insistent, pulling me deeper into an experience I never envisioned, a situation spiraling beyond my control. His chest pressed against mine, the heat of his body seeping through the thin fabric of my t-shirt. For a fleeting moment, I lost myself in the sensation, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and raw emotion, grappling with the reality of what was happening. Then, as suddenly as he had initiated the kiss, Dylan pulled away. He sat back on the edge of the bed, his breathing heavy, his face inches from mine, his eyes locked onto mine with an unfamiliar intensity. The air crackled with tension, a suffocating thickness that made it difficult to breathe. I swallowed hard, struggling to comprehend the situation, but my thoughts were a jumbled mess. I wanted to scream, to demand his departure, to tell him how wrong this was, but my body refused to cooperate. A part of me, a darker, hidden part, craved his presence, this forbidden closeness that terrified me more than anything. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. How could I articulate the turmoil within me, the lingering sensation of his lips, the dangerous pull I felt whenever I looked at him? I don't understand, Dylan, I finally whispered, my voice unsteady. "Why are you doing this?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, the corner of his mouth twitched, as if suppressing a grin. It was almost as if he relished my discomfort, watching me struggle with the complexity of it all. It's not about what you understand, David," he said, his voice low and calm. "It's about what you feel." I shook my head, my pulse pounding in my ears. "This is wrong. You're my stepson. This is wrong." Dylan's gaze didn't waver. He leaned in closer again, his breath warm against my skin, placing a hand on my arm. The touch was light, almost gentle, but it carried an unsettling weight, as if he was testing my reaction. "I know what you're feeling," he said softly, speaking as if I were the one who was confused. "It's not wrong. It's just different." His words sent my heart racing. For a moment I questioned my own sanity. My body ached with conflicting emotions: fear, desire, confusion, guilt. My mind screamed at me to push him away, to remind him that he was still just a kid, my stepson. But another part of me, a buried part I couldn't control, was drawn to him, captivated by his every move, his every word, his uncanny ability to unsettle me. "No," I said, my voice firming. "This is wrong, Dylan. You need to leave. Right now." But Dylan didn't move. Instead, he leaned in again, this time brushing his lips against my ear, his voice a low whisper that sent shivers down my spine. "I don't think you really want me to leave," he said, his breath hot against my skin. "I think you're just scared of what you want." His words cut through me like a knife. He was right in a way. There was fear, but not of him. It was a fear of what he was awakening within me, a long-buried desire I didn't understand but couldn't deny. "Dylan, please," I whispered, my voice breaking as I finally summoned the strength to push him away. "You can't do this. This isn't what you want." He pulled back, but his eyes remained fixed on mine, dark and searching, studying me as if I were a puzzle he was trying to solve. "Don't lie to yourself, David," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "I know what you want. You can't hide it anymore." I wanted to scream, to deny his accusations, to tell him he was wrong, that I wanted no part of this. But the words caught in my throat, strangled by the truth he had so easily exposed, the truth I had been trying to deny for so long. The truth was, I was torn. The emotions swirling within me were too complex, too overwhelming. As a grown man, I should have been able to control myself, to see through whatever games Dylan was playing, to stand firm in the knowledge that this was wrong. But I couldn't. Dylan rose from the bed and took a step back, his eyes fixed on me, his expression unreadable, as if waiting for me to break. "You can't stop it, David," he said softly, his voice almost matter-of-fact. "You can't stop me. Not now." His words hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a one-time incident. Dylan wasn't going to walk away, and neither was I. Somewhere deep inside, I had already crossed a line of no return. He turned and left the room without another word, leaving me in the darkness, my mind a maelstrom of confusion, fear, and desire. The following days were a slow burn of tension and anticipation. Dylan's presence was a constant weight on my chest. Every time I saw him, I was reminded of the kiss, the touch, the intensity that radiated from him. It was as if he had claimed a part of me I hadn't known existed until he exposed it. I tried to avoid him, to maintain a distance, but he was always there, lurking in the corners of my mind, in the spaces I couldn't escape. Every glance in his direction sent the same pulse of awareness, the same electric tension, through me. And he knew it. One evening after dinner, as I sat on the couch attempting to focus on the television, the house was quiet, but the silence felt oppressive. Dylan had been unusually distant all evening, avoiding eye contact and barely speaking. Then, after a prolonged period of silence, he appeared in the living room doorway, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach churn. "David," he said, his voice calm but heavy with unspoken meaning. "We need to talk." I didn't want to talk. I wanted to pretend the incident was a mistake, something I could forget. But Dylan wasn't going to let that happen. He was persistent, always had been. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My throat was dry, constricted with fear, anticipation, and an unnamed emotion I couldn't quite place. "Come to my room," he said, his voice low and inviting. And just like that, I found myself standing, my body moving before my mind could catch up, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what he intended to do, but I knew I couldn't stop this any longer. I had made a choice, not a conscious one in the traditional sense, but a choice nonetheless. It wasn't something I could rationalize or plan for. But when Dylan looked at me like that, when he invited me into his world, a world where the lines between right and wrong, desire and taboo were blurred, I couldn't resist. I couldn't walk away. My legs felt weak, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out all other sounds. I wasn't sure if I was afraid or excited, perhaps both, perhaps neither. All I knew was that I was no longer in control. Dylan didn't wait for a response. He simply turned and walked down the hallway, his movements fluid and confident, as if he had already choreographed this dance. He knew exactly how the night would unfold, and somehow, so did I. He led me down the hallway, his presence so commanding I felt as though I was being pulled along by invisible strings, tethered to him. His footsteps echoed softly on the floor, a rhythm that matched the frantic beat of my heart. When we reached his door, he stopped and he turned to face me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Dylan," I whispered, my voice shaky. I wanted to say more, to question him, to plead with him to stop, but the words felt hollow in the face of what was happening. He didn't speak, just reached out and gently touched my arm, guiding me into the room. The room was dimly lit, a soft desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The air was thick with anticipation, a palpable tension that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I froze, unsure how to proceed. My mind screamed at me to turn and run, but my body, betraying my rational thoughts, remained rooted to the spot. Dylan moved behind me, closing the door softly, the click of the latch echoing in the silence. When I turned to face him, he was standing so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that felt as if he could see straight through me, as if he knew every secret desire I had ever tried to hide. "I don't want to fight this anymore," he said, his voice a low, almost soothing murmur. "You don't have to fight it either." I shook my head, trying to dispel the confusion that clouded my thoughts. I had always prided myself on being rational, on making sensible decisions. But now, standing before Dylan, none of that mattered. I felt like I was drowning in his gaze, in the heat that simmered between us, in the quiet desperation that hung heavy in the air. "I don't know what you want from me," I mumbled, ashamed of the words even as I spoke them. Yet, I couldn't deny the unsettling truth that churned in my stomach. "I want everything," Dylan replied simply. "I want all of you. I've always wanted you, David." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to tell him it was impossible, that I couldn't, shouldn't, let this happen. But as I opened my mouth to protest, Dylan reached out and touched my face, his fingers warm and gentle against my skin. The tenderness of his touch, the way it seemed to erase all my doubts, was almost unbearable. "Please," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Before I could stop him, before I could even think, Dylan kissed me. It wasn't tentative or questioning this time. It was purposeful, filled with a desperate urgency that consumed us both. His hands roamed over my chest, pulling me closer, as if trying to meld our bodies into one. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was respond, my body betraying me before my mind could even process what was happening. And when I kissed him back, I realized just how far I had fallen. I couldn't stop. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight of my life, responsibilities, relationships, the rules that governed my every decision, disappeared. There was only Dylan, the heat of his body against mine, the taste of his lips, the pressure of his hands on my skin. It felt like I was floating, like nothing else existed outside of this moment. I heard myself moan, a sound that shocked me as much as it seemed to shock him. He smiled against my lips, a wicked grin that sent shivers down my spine. His hands moved lower, brushing against the waistband of my pants, and I gasped, pulling back just enough to look into his eyes. "Dylan," I breathed, my voice trembling. "This is wrong. We can't do this." His expression softened, as if offering reassurance, but there was a predatory gleam in his eyes. "We already have," he said softly, "and now you're mine." Before I could protest again, he kissed me deeply, silencing the doubts that flooded my mind. His lips were insistent, demanding, pulling me into a world where the lines between right and wrong were irrevocably blurred. I was lost, adrift in a sea of forbidden desires, and for the first time in my life, I didn't want to be found. I was his. His lips were everywhere, my mouth, my neck, my chest, his hands exploring, pulling at my clothes as if they were mere obstacles to what he desired. And I let him. I let him tear down the walls I had spent years building, let him pull me deeper into his world, into the darkness I had so desperately tried to avoid. The lines between right and wrong, father and stepson, blurred until they vanished entirely. There was only the two of us, the desperate need to touch, to feel, to lose ourselves in each other. Somewhere in the recesses of my mind, I knew this was wrong, something I could never explain or justify. But in that moment, none of it mattered. I couldn't deny the desire, and I didn't want to. Dylan's hands moved skillfully, undoing the buttons of my shirt, his touch sending sparks of heat through my body. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and yet it only intensified my desire for him. He seemed to sense this, his lips curling into a smug smile as he pushed me back onto the bed, his body pressing into mine as he hovered above. "Don't fight it, David," he whispered, his voice almost a taunt. I didn't answer. I wasn't sure I even wanted to. I let out a shuddering breath as Dylan's hands roamed lower, the realization hitting me that I was no longer a passive participant in this twisted game. I was complicit, just as much a part of it as he was. And in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. The next morning I woke up alone in Dylan's bed. The room was quiet, still. The events of the previous night felt like a fever dream, a hallucination. Shame and guilt washed over me, every fiber of my being screaming that this was wrong, that I should leave, go back to my old life. But something else lingered, something darker, deeper, a hunger that hadn't been satisfied, that wouldn't be satisfied with just one night. I knew it now. Dylan had made me his, and somehow I had let him. I stood up slowly, my body aching. I avoided looking at the bed, at the empty space beside me, unwilling to confront the aftermath of my actions. But as I walked toward the door, something caught my eye. Dylan, watching me from the doorway. "You won't leave," he said softly, as if reading my thoughts. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. "You'll come back," Dylan interrupted, his voice sure and unwavering. "We both know you will." And with those words I realized he was right. I couldn't leave. No matter how wrong it was, no matter how much it terrified me, I was in too deep. There was no escape from what we had started. The game, whatever it was far from over. It had only just begun.